The Wyoming winter of 1882 does not forgive. Somewhere in the Elk Horn Mountains, beneath a sky that has forgotten the color of warmth, a woman stands in the snow with nothing left. No home, no money, no name on any deed, only a child at her side, a dog at her feet, and a storm closing in from every direction. The dog stops. He does not growl. He does not retreat. He turns toward a wall of solid rock and does not move again. What happens next cannot be explained by luck. What is hidden inside that mountain has been waiting not for years, but for generations. Built by hands she will never shake, kept by strangers whose names she does not yet know. A secret that 3 families buried in silence and 1 young woman is about to inherit. She has 60 seconds to decide. The storm does not wait, neither does she. Now here is the story. The smoke rose from the chimney of a house that no longer belonged to them. Petra Winslow stood at the edge of the tree line with her younger sister June pressed against her side, and their father's old husky, Flint, leaning warm and solid against her legs. The snow had been falling since before dawn, the kind that didn't drift or swirl but came straight down, heavy and deliberate, as though the sky had reached a decision it intended to keep. Through the white curtain of it she could see the orange glow behind the parlor window, the shadow of a man moving unhurried behind the glass. Her uncle Gideon had lit the same lamp her mother used to read by, and something about that particular detail settled in Petra's chest like a stone dropped into still water. Her father, Thomas Winslow, had worked the Sweetwater County coal seam for 11 years. He had come home black-faced and coughing every evening, eaten his supper at that table, fallen asleep in that chair beside that lamp, and had been dead since August. The haulage beam collapsed on a Tuesday morning. They said it was fast. They said he wouldn't have felt much. Petra had learned, in the months since, that people said those things not because they were true, but because they didn't know what else to offer a 22-year-old woman standing in a mine office doorway with a 9-year-old sister at her back. Her mother had been gone longer, typhoid fever when June was 5 and Petra was 13. From that year forward, Petra had kept the household mending clothes for the other miners' families, tending the garden through spring and summer, teaching June her letters on winter evenings beside the same lamp Gideon was now burning as though he had always owned it. He had arrived six weeks after her father's funeral with papers. She hadn't understood all of them, and there had been no lawyer she could afford, and no neighbor willing to stand against Gideon Winslow in front of a county clerk. The papers claimed Thomas had borrowed against the property and never repaid. The signatures at the bottom were ones she didn't recognize. The clerk stamped them anyway, with the carefully expressionless face of a man who had decided in advance not to be involved in whatever he was facilitating. On a gray Thursday in November, Gideon told them to take what they could carry and be gone before supper. Petra had taken their father's canvas rucksack, a wool blanket, a folding knife, a box of matches, and half a loaf of bread already going hard. June had taken the small cloth rabbit she'd carried since she was a baby, the one she hadn't put down since the day their mother died. Flint had simply followed them, as he always did, as though the direction they were walking was the only direction that made any sense. That had been 3 days ago. The first night they sheltered under a deadfall pine on the eastern slope, the rucksack wedged as a windbreak, and the blanket pulled over all 3 of them. The second night they found a shallow cut in the rock above a dry creek bed, barely deep enough to keep the snow off. But Flint had curled himself between June and the open air, and his body heat had been enough. The third day the storm worsened. The sky dropped lower, the temperature dropped further, and the bread was crumbs now, and June had not complained once, which worried Petra more than crying would have. She had been studying the ridge line all morning, trying to remember what her father had told her about the Elk Horn country. He had prospected these hills briefly in his younger years, before the coal work, before the house, before any of them existed. He used to say the mountains up here kept secrets better than people did. She had thought it was the kind of thing father said. She was beginning to think he had meant it more plainly than that. The snow thickened. The tree line on the far slope dissolved into white. Petra pulled June closer and looked down at Flint. The dog had been walking with his nose low all morning, quartering back and forth the way he did when tracking something not yet identified. Now he stopped. He lifted his head. Both ears came forward at once, which meant something specific and certain rather than merely curious. He was staring at a section of the rock face roughly a quarter-mile north, where the ridge curved away and a cluster of old ponderosa pines grew so close to the stone that their roots had visibly split the base of the cliff over what must have been decades of slow, patient work. Petra watched him. He did not growl. He did not tuck his tail. He simply stood with every muscle gathered and his attention fixed on that particular stretch of rock, as though he had been given an instruction in a language she couldn't hear. She looked at June. The girl's lips had gone pale at the edges. Not blue, not yet, but the kind of pale that moved in a specific direction if you didn't act. She had 2 choices. Turn south toward Laramie, a full day's walk in fair weather, and something closer to impossible in this, or trust the dog. She trusted the dog. The snow was mid-calf by the time they reached the base of the cliff. Up close, the rock face was more complex than it had appeared at a distance. Roots had worked into the stone over what must have been decades, wedging and levering until sections of the face had shifted and cracked. There were gaps where the rock had moved apart, most too narrow to be useful, and Petra was scanning them with the attention of someone who had run out of alternatives when Flint walked directly to a low horizontal fissure and pushed his muzzle into the dark. Then he went through, not squeezed through, not struggled, simply walked forward and was gone, swallowed by the shadow between the stone, and for one long moment there was only the sound of wind, the hiss of snow through the ponderosa needles above, and June's quiet breathing at her side. Then Flint barked once. From somewhere inside the rock, the gap was tight. Petra turned sideways and ducked her head and pressed flat against the cold stone, keeping one hand behind her for June the entire way through, feeling the girl's fingers locked around hers with a grip stronger than it had any right to be. 8 feet of pure darkness and cold stone smell, and then it opened. Cave was enormous. Not the darkness, not the cold, but the sheer scale of it, the way their breathing changed the moment they were inside, becoming rounder, more contained, bouncing gently off surfaces much further away than they expected. Petra stood still and let her eyes adjust. Thin seams of light entered through fractures high in the ceiling, not enough to illuminate clearly, but enough to see by in the slow, careful way of winter afternoon. The floor was dry stone, mostly flat, littered with old pine needles that must have blown through the upper fractures over many years. At the far end of the cave, beneath the largest cluster of roots she had ever seen, roots that had come through the ceiling not in cracks but in great ropey bundles, as though the ancient ponderosa above had decided to grow a second home. Underground stood a house, a wooden house, a real one, not salvage beadboard nailed together in desperation, not a collapsed shell. 4 walls, a pitched roof, a covered porch with 2 steps, windows fitted with actual glass, dark with grime but intact. The structure stood perhaps 12 feet tall at its peak, built with a care and deliberateness that made no sense to Petra until she stopped trying to explain it and simply looked at it. No footprints in the dust on the cave floor except the ones they were making now, and the pad marks of Flint's paws leading toward the porch steps. Petra's hand found the folding knife in her coat pocket. Old habit. She held it there without opening it and listened. No sound from inside. No sound at all beyond the faint white noise of the storm, which reached them here as something distant, like weather happening in another world entirely. June was at her shoulder. Is someone in there? Her voice was barely above a breath. Petra didn't answer, because she honestly didn't know. Flint was on the porch. He sniffed along the base of the door, unhurried, then sat and looked back at them with his pale eyes, as though he had been waiting some time for them to catch up. His tail moved once across the wooden planks. That was all the assessment she was going to get. Every board in the porch was still solid underfoot. She pressed on the door and it opened without resistance, the hinges groaning with the particular complaint of metal that hadn't moved in a long time. A cloud of dust drifted out through the beam of gray light from the nearest window, and the smell that followed the dust was nothing like she expected. Old wood, yes. Dry herbs of some kind, faintly medicinal, faintly sweet. The ghost of wood smoke from a fire cold for years, but not rot. Not the wet mold smell of true abandonment. Something else entirely, the smell of a place where people had once been careful. Flint walked inside, circled the main room once, and lay down in front of a stone fireplace on the far wall with his head on his paws. He was done deciding. The decision was made. June walked in behind him. She stopped in the center of the room, turned slowly in a full circle, looked up at the ceiling beams and the stone chimney and the dusty windows letting in their gray winter light. Then she turned to Petra. For the first time in 3 days longer, if Petra was being honest with herself, the fear was not the loudest thing in her little sister's face. Petra stood at the threshold and made herself be methodical. The fireplace was stone, large, with an iron swing arm for a pot and a proper damper. The floor was wooden plank, solid, no spring or rot when she walked it. The windows were intact. Along the near wall, a kitchen, wooden counter, shelves mostly bare, a cast iron stove, a dry sink, hooks where tools had once hung. A narrow hall led to a small bedroom with a wooden bed frame and a folded quilt on the mattress, old straw but dry. A second door off the hall opened into a storage room with empty wooden shelves. She checked every corner. She looked at the rafters. She stood in the bedroom doorway and breathed. There was no one here. There had not been anyone here for a very long time. Whoever had been here last had left the door unlocked and the quilt on the bed, and had not, in whatever circumstances caused them to leave, chosen to destroy what they had built. Petra crossed to the fireplace, ash in it, cold and pale as flour. The wood box beside the hearth was empty. She would need wood before dark, but they were inside. They were out of the snow. The walls were standing and the roof was holding, and Flint was already asleep. That night she didn't sleep. She sat in the chair nearest the door with the folding knife open on her knee and listened to the storm work itself out against the rock above, muffled and distant, while June slept on the mattress with the quilt pulled to her chin and Flint pressed against the back of her knees. Petra watched them both and thought about the lock that didn't exist, and then she thought about the footprints they hadn't left out there, and then she thought about nothing at all for a while, which was the closest she'd come to rest in 3 days. Dawn arrived as a change in the quality of the dark. Gray seeped through the dirty glass and found the surfaces of things: the iron stove, the wooden counter, the dust on the shelf boards, and made them visible without making them warm. Petra folded the knife and put it away. June was still sleeping. Flint had moved to the door during the night, which was information of a kind. First problem was water. She had known it would be. They'd had snow to eat during the 3 days outside, which was inefficient and cold but functional. Inside, there was no snow. There was a dry sink, and there was presumably a reason someone had built that dry sink in that particular location. She went to the kitchen and looked more carefully. The counter had a channel cut along its inner edge. She hadn't noticed in the dark a wooden trough running toward the back wall and through a gap fitted with a clay seal, dark with age. She followed the logic of it to a pipe, actual turned wood pipe in fitted sections sealed with pine pitch, that entered the wall from outside. Someone had engineered water delivery to this kitchen. The pipe was dry now, either frozen or empty after years of disuse, but it had been built with a specific source in mind. Flint was at the door. She opened it and followed him across the cave floor toward the far wall, where the stone curved back into a secondary depression. The air there was colder and had a different quality of freshness the main cave lacked, and she found the source within a minute. A narrow fracture at the base of the wall where water seeped through the stone in a thin, continuous ribbon, collected in a natural basin no larger than a wash basin, drained away through a crack in the floor. She touched it, cold, clear, moving. She tasted it from her fingertip, clean. She stood and looked at the wooden pipe system running toward the house and understood. Someone had not merely found this cave and built a house inside it. They had surveyed it, planned it, studied where the water came from, and built the structure to make use of it. This was not accident or impulse. This was someone who thought in years. She filled their bottle and went back inside. She woke June with a hand on her shoulder, and the girl sat up with the clarity of children who sleep hard and wake completely, looking around the room as though she needed a moment to confirm that yesterday had actually happened. Petra put the bottle in her hands. Drink slowly. June drank and was quiet for a moment. Then the dog found it. He did. June looked at Flint with the gravity of someone issuing a formal commendation. Good dog. Flint's tail moved once against the floor. Firewood was the second problem. Petra addressed it that same morning, going out through the passage into the cold and into the forest with the folding knife and a length of rope she'd found coiled on the storage room shelf. The storm had passed some time before dawn, and the world outside had the particular bright white silence that follows heavy snow, painful to look at directly. She found deadfall within 200 yards of the cliff face, branches broken and dried under a skim of new snow that brushed off clean. She made 4 trips before June appeared at the cave entrance, still holding her cloth rabbit to watch. You should be inside. I was helping in my head, June said. This was something she said sometimes. Petra had learned not to argue with it. The first fire that afternoon had the particular satisfaction of fire that works on the first try when you've needed it badly, the kindling catching, the draft pulling cleanly up the old stone chimney, the smoke going where it was supposed to go. Warmth moved out from the firebox slowly, the way warmth does in stone buildings, but it moved. By the time the cave windows had gone amber with afternoon light, the main room was no longer cold. It was merely cool, and cool was something she could work with. Food was the third problem, and it was the hardest because it could not be solved in an afternoon. She searched the kitchen thoroughly, while June sat at the small table, working at the cloth rabbit's ear, which had come loose. The shelves held 2 empty ceramic crocks, a wooden spoon with a cracked handle, a tin cup without a handle, and a cast iron skillet on a hook that still held. A low cabinet yielded 3 empty preserving jars with lids rusted shut. Nothing edible, nothing close. The people who had left this place had taken their provisions and left the tools. She went back to the storage room. Rusted nails in a tin, a handsaw needing sharpening, a hammer with a sound head, 3 lengths of rope, a whetstone. Useful in time, not edible. That evening she told June they would go looking in the morning, keeping her voice matter-of-fact, and June nodded with the particular patience Petra recognized as the thing children grew, when adults stopped being able to fix everything immediately. The next morning, Flint leading, she went north along the base of the cliff and angled uphill into the timber. Animal tracks everywhere in the snow, which meant the forest was alive with things she couldn't catch yet. The creek she heard before she saw it turned out to be a legitimate watercourse, smooth over pale stones in a channel 4 feet wide. In a south-facing clearing where the ponderosas broke the wind and the snow was thinner, she found what she needed, a stand of hawthorn, branches studded with dark red berries that had dried and shriveled but not rotted, held tight through the freeze. She filled both coat pockets. They were bitter, and Mealy and June ate them without complaint and said they tasted like something trying to be an apple. Creek yielded fish on the second attempt. She had made a hook the first evening from a bent nail straightened and rebent carefully over the edge of the stove, threaded on fine cord unraveled from the rope coil's edge, with a hawthorn berry for bait. She lost the first 2 fish to impatience and the third to a slipping knot. The fourth she held a small trout, silver in the late afternoon light, thrashing briefly before she dispatched it cleanly. She cooked it in the cast iron skillet that evening, and the smell filled the house in a way that made Flint sit up from the hearth, and stare at the stove with an intensity that verged on philosophy. June laughed at him. It was the first time she had laughed in longer than Petra could accurately remember. A small laugh, careful, as though testing whether the mechanism still worked. But it worked. It was enough. It was a start, and starts were what she understood. Over the next week, Petra built systems. She built them the way her father had taught her to approach any problem. Break it into what you can control today and what you'll need to control eventually, and don't confuse the two categories. Today was water, food, warmth. Eventually was everything else. The firewood operation became a morning task. She identified 3 deadfall trees within reasonable distance of the cave, enough timber to last weeks if worked systematically, and began cutting and carrying in sections, stacking them inside the cave against the wall nearest the entrance. June took charge of the indoor stack beside the hearth, arranging pieces with a seriousness that suggested she had decided this was her domain and would govern it accordingly. The fish became more reliable as Petra learned the creek. There was a pool below a particular curve where trout congregated in the afternoon, and if she was patient and still, she could usually take 2 or 3. Combined with hawthorn berries and later with dried yarrow seed heads from along the ridge, they had enough. Not comfortable, not abundant. Enough, and that was the word she kept returning to, because it was honest and made no promises the situation wasn't in a position to keep. At the end of the first week, she cleaned the windows with snow and a strip of cloth torn from her underskirt, and the light that came into the main room afterward was a different quality entirely, brighter and more honest, and the house looked less like something she had stumbled into, and more like something she was living in. June noticed and then went back to what she had been doing, which was drawing on a smooth piece of pine board she'd found in the storage room, using a charred stick for a line. A map of the cave. Rough and tilted but recognizable, the entrance passage, the spring depression, the house, a small lumpy shape near the fireplace that was clearly meant to be Flint. That's good, Petra said, meaning it. June studied it critically. Flint's ears are wrong. They're too pointy. He has rounder ears than that. She held the board up for comparison. Flint, who had been watching this conversation with the neutral dignity of a dog being discussed in his presence, did not appear to have strong opinions about his own ears. On the 9th day, Petra found the kitchen beam. She had been checking the structure of the house methodically, pressing on joints and testing the give-in floorboards and tapping her knuckles along wall sections to hear the difference between solid and hollow. The main beam above the kitchen counter was sound. She ran her hand along it and found, near the wall end where the timber met the stone and shadow gathered, a series of deliberate cuts. Not accidental, not wear. Carved, a letter, a period, 2 more letters, a date, OM 1859. Below it in smaller cuts made with a finer blade, built for those who come after. She stood with her fingers resting on the letters and read the words twice, then a third time. The cave was quiet around her. June was somewhere behind her, rearranging the firewood by some system that made sense only to her. Flint was sleeping. Whoever OM was, they had not built this house and then forgotten it. They had built it with the specific understanding that they were not the last people who would need it. She took her hand off the beam and opened the second kitchen drawer stuck, which was why she hadn't tried it before, and inside found a folded piece of paper and a list written in a careful, slanted hand. Materials, oak peg sizes and counts, pitch pine for the roof, clay quantities for the chimney seal, a builder's inventory. But at the bottom of the list, below a double line that ended the technical section, someone else had written in a lighter hand with a finer implement, 6 words, north wall soft near floor. Reinforce, same different person, different time. Someone had come after OM and found what he'd left and added to it. Petra read the note twice, put it on the counter and looked at the north wall. She would check it tomorrow. She checked it that same afternoon. The plaster near the floor gave slightly under her thumb where it shouldn't have. She pressed in 3 places and found a section roughly 18 inches wide, where the backing had softened and separated from the stone behind it. Frost-damaged water working through the rock over many winters, expanding and contracting until the seal cracked. She spent an hour remaking the seal with clay from the spring depression mixed with ash from the fireplace, the same clay-ash combination she'd watched old Sam Hartley use on his cellar walls back in Sweetwater County. It wasn't elegant. It was functional, which was what the situation called for. She did not yet know who had written that warning. She did not yet know whether they had stayed long or briefly. But they had been here, and they had thought about the next person. The quilt on the bedroom bed was old but well made, pieced from wool in squares of dark blue and faded red, stitched with the dense, even hand of someone who had time and took care with it. Petra had been using it for June since the first night, doubling it over so that it covered her properly. One morning, shaking it out before remaking the bed, she found something she'd missed. In the lower right corner, half an inch from the edge binding, 2 letters and a date worked in thread that had once been dark, but had faded to barely visible against the wool. AP 1874. Not OM, a different initial, a different year, 15 years after the beam inscription. Someone else had been here, had slept under this quilt, had sewn their mark into its corner before they left. She turned the corner of the quilt over in her fingers and thought about the handwriting in the kitchen drawer, and the repaired north wall, and the herbs she hadn't found yet but would. There was something accumulating here she didn't have a word for, yet a chain of strangers who had each arrived with nothing, found something, taken what they needed, left what they could, moved on, and in leaving had thought about whoever came next. She put the quilt back on the bed and tucked it around June's feet. That night the fire burned well. The house was warm in a way it hadn't been the first few days, the stone of the fireplace having finally absorbed enough heat to radiate it back through the cooler hours. June had fallen asleep at the table over her board map, and Petra had carried her to the bedroom without waking her, a small logistical feat that felt, in the moment, like a particular kind of victory. She sat alone by the fire with a tin cup of water and listened to the sounds the cave made in the dark, the faint creak of the old ponderosa roots shifting overhead, the distant drip of the spring, occasional small collapses of snow from the upper fractures. Flint lay across the threshold of the bedroom door, a choice he'd made independently and which she'd stopped questioning. She was not done with Gideon Winslow. She knew that as clearly as she knew the temperature or the depth of the creek pool. He was not the kind of man who left loose ends, and Petra Winslow, living somewhere unknown in the Elk Horn country with her father's dog and a 9-year-old who hadn't cried once in 3 days, was a loose end of the most troublesome kind. But that was not tonight's problem. Tonight's problem had been food and fire, and the north wall and the quilt, and the letters AP and OM, carved and stitched into things by people she would never meet who had thought, in their leaving, about who might come next. She reached down and put her hand on Flint's flank. He shifted slightly in his sleep, the way dogs do when they're running something down in a dream. She let the fire burn down to coals and did not add more wood, because the stone held heat long enough now that it didn't need feeding through the night, which was one of the things she had learned. Then she went to the kitchen and opened the second drawer and read the words at the bottom of the list one more time in the low red light of the coals. North wall soft near floor. Reinforce fixed, she thought. Then she went to bed. The second week began with a problem she hadn't anticipated. The cast iron skillet had developed a crack along its base and now leaked fat into the fire whenever she cooked in it, which meant the skillet was unreliable, and the fire smelled of burning grease, and the situation required a solution she didn't yet have. She set the skillet aside and spent the morning thinking about it, while sharpening the hand saw blade with the whetstone from the storage room, drawing the stone along each tooth in turn with the patience of someone who has learned that tools only fail you if you let them get that way. The whetstone was good quality, harder than the cheap ones from the general store in Sweetwater, and it had been used before its surface had a particular concavity worn into it by someone else's hands. She thought about that as she sharpened, whose hands, what they had sharpened, how many winters ago. The cave had a way of making her think about time differently than she was used to. Time outside moved in weeks and seasons and payments due. Time in here moved in the slow accumulation of things done and things still requiring doing. She solved the skillet problem by finding in the storage room a trivet she'd overlooked because it was under the lowest shelf and partially covered by old pine needles. The trivet was intact and fit over the fireplace's ember bed, which let her use the cracked skillet above the heat rather than directly in it, reducing the stress on the fracture enough to make it functional. Not a repair, an accommodation. She was learning to tell the difference. June had graduated from the pine board to the kitchen wall itself, using a charred stick sharpened to a fine point to extend her map across a section of plaster that wasn't load-bearing. The map had grown considerably. It now showed the creek with fish marked as small squares, the hawthorn stand as a cluster of dots, the route to the deadfall timber as a dotted line, and in the upper corner, entirely out of proportion, a large and detailed rendering of Flint with correctly rounded ears. Petra stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it. You fixed his ears. June examined the drawing with professional detachment. I had to do them 3 times. She pointed at faint marks beneath the final version. Those are the wrong ones. The drawing was getting better, and the true thing deserved acknowledging. June had always had their mother's eye for the shape of things, the way a detail sat relative to what surrounded it, and watching that quality survive the last months intact, watching it not just survive but develop, was something Petra turned over in her mind, the way she turned over a difficult problem, looking for what it told her. The curio cabinet along the hall wall, which she had categorized as decorative and therefore low priority, turned out to hold something more useful than decoration. She had been working her way through every fixed and built-in element of the house, pressing on panels and pulling on trim pieces. The cabinet had 3 shelves behind glass doors that didn't latch anymore. The lower shelf held a ceramic ring she couldn't identify a purpose for and a folded square of canvas and apron, heavy-duty, the kind a carpenter would wear, still sound along its seams. But when she reached further back, her fingers found a gap between the shelf base and the cabinet's back panel, and in that gap, a folded paper, a list this time, a different kind of document. She took it to the window for light and opened it carefully, the paper stiff and reluctant after years of being folded. The writing was in 2 different inks at 2 different times. The first was a dark brown-black, formal, with the careful hand of someone who had been taught penmanship and taken the teaching seriously. At the top, a territorial surveyor's header, March 1858, Wyoming Territory. A plot description, meets and bounds, compass bearings, creek reference, ridge reference, 40 acres. At the bottom, above a signature, a line she read twice, Obadiah Aaron Morrow, owner of record. This was a land document, not a copy, not a reference, an original survey claim. She turned it over. The reverse held a stamped seal, partially legible, from an office in Cheyenne. The second ink, added later in a lighter hand, ran along the margin. O.M. gone to Oregon, 1863. Left the house, left this, left it for what it's worth to someone. She sat down on the kitchen floor with the document in her lap. Obadiah Morrow had owned this land, owned it properly, with a survey and a seal, in 1858. He had left in 1863, not burned out, not lost, simply departed, and he had left the document behind with a marginal note that acknowledged, without sentiment, that he was giving it up. He'd known he wasn't coming back. He'd known someone might come after him, and he'd left them something to work with. Wyoming Territory had been organized only in 1869. She didn't know precisely what had happened to land claims that predated the territory's existence, whether they transferred or expired or dissolved into the federal surveys. But the land was here, the house was here, the document was here. She put it on the counter, waited with the tin cup, and went back to work. Because the alternative was to sit with the document and the question it raised, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. She had learned in the last year to place certain problems in a specific part of her mind and leave them there until she had enough information to think about them usefully. The document went into that place. That evening, after June had gone to sleep, Petra found the notebook. She had been looking in the storage room for another length of rope, and she pulled the lowest shelf away from the wall to check whether anything had fallen behind it. There it was, a soft-cover notebook, ledger-sized, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had dried and cracked but had done its job. She carried it to the fire. The first 20 pages were in the same formal hand as the land document. Technical content, roof pitch calculations, chimney draw ratios, depth requirements for the clay seal on the water pipe, species of wood preferred for each structural application, and why. Not a diary, a construction manual. Morrow had written down not just what he did but why he did it, and how someone might maintain or replicate it, and the precision suggested a man who believed his knowledge had value and didn't want it lost. Then the handwriting changed. The new hand was smaller and less formal, slightly hurried, with the occasional crossing out that the first hand never allowed itself. A name at the top of the page, A. Pallister, winter 1873. A brief entry, arrived November, husband lost at Powder River that spring, 2 boys, nowhere to go. Found the house, found the notebook, used the clay method for the window frame on the east side. It works. Morrow knew what he was doing. The entries continued through the winter in brief, practical observations, what the creek level did in deep freeze, where the best deadfall was, which direction the wind came from during a north storm and how that affected the chimney draft. Then in April 1874, a final entry, leaving for my sister's place in Cheyenne. Boys are well, left the quilt on the bed, added herbs to the kitchen drawer, yarrow, thyme, willow bark, for whoever needs them. Fixed the north wall as best I could. This house saved us. I hope it saves whoever comes next. Petra read this entry 3 times. She had drunk Agnes Pallister's yarrow tea. June had slept warm under Agnes Pallister's quilt. She had repaired the wall Agnes Pallister had identified and partially fixed 9 years before her. She had read Agnes Pallister's note in the kitchen drawer without knowing who had written it, and now she knew. A widow with 2 boys and nowhere to go, in a winter that must have looked very much like this one. She closed the notebook and sat with it on her knees and looked at the fire. There was a word for what this was, though it wasn't a word she'd been taught for this kind of situation. Inheritance was the word, but not in the way Gideon used it, not as a claim on someone else's accumulated luck. Something older than that. The kind of inheritance that moved forward instead of backward, that accumulated not in money but in knowledge and repair, and the habit of leaving things better than you found them, for people whose names you would never know. She opened the notebook to the first blank page after Agnes Pallister's entries and looked at it for a long time. Then she set it on the shelf beside the fire and went to bed. The morning she found the footprints was a clear morning, the kind Wyoming produced after a run of hard weather skies so purely blue it looked constructed, snow reflecting the sun with a flat, indifferent brilliance. Flint was at the cave entrance before she was. She heard him before she was fully awake, not barking, not growling, but producing the low, continuous sound he made when something required her attention without yet requiring her alarm. She pulled on her coat and boots and looked out through the passage. On the fresh snow outside, one set of footprints. Men's boots, medium size, flat-heeled, not work boots. Prints came from the east along the cliff face, slowed near the gap she and June and Flint had come through weeks ago, stopped. both feet parallel and close together, someone who had paused deliberately. Then the prints turned and went back the way they had come. They had not come through. Either they hadn't found the gap, or they had found it and decided against it. But they had been here, close enough that she could count 5 distinct pressure marks from the right boot heel. Recently enough that the top half-inch of new snow in the prints was still sharp-edged. She went back inside without touching anything. June was awake at the kitchen table with her board and charred stick, working on something new. She looked up. Whatever she read in Petra's face made her set the board down. Someone was outside. Petra kept her voice level. June looked at Flint, still sitting very still at the entrance, ears forward. Did they come in? No. Do you know who it is? The honest answer was that she didn't know for certain, but she knew what she thought. There was one person with both a reason to find her and the resources to pay someone to do it. She had been gone more than 2 months. The county records for the Winslow property would show a transaction without the required signature of the living adult heir. Gideon could not complete that transaction without Petra's signature, and every month that passed without it made the problem more likely to be examined by someone with authority. Get dressed, she said, and stay close to the house today. June dressed without argument and spent the morning sitting cross-legged in front of the fire with Flint on one side and her board on the other. Petra spent the morning checking every structural element of the cave entrance area, then wedged 2 deadfall branches across the outer face of the gap at a low angle, positioned so that new snow would catch on them and build across the opening. Not a lock. Misdirection, and misdirection was what the situation offered. 3 days passed without another set of prints. She did not relax, but she redistributed her attention, because vigilance that doesn't vary its focus becomes blindness in a specific direction. It was during those 3 days that she worked back through the notebook more carefully, and found what she'd missed the first time, a third hand, just 2 pages, at the very back. A child's handwriting, large, uneven, the letters not yet fully controlled but legible. A boy's name. Caleb Pallister, age 11, winter 1873. A single entry. Mama says we are leaving in the spring. I do not want to leave. This is the best house I have ever seen. There is a dog carved on the shelf in the bedroom and it looks like a real dog. Mama said I can leave this here. So I am leaving it. She went immediately to the bedroom and looked at the shelf above the bed, which she had registered as empty during her initial survey. She had been wrong about empty. At the far end, pushed against the wall where the shadow was deepest, was a small carved figure perhaps 4 inches tall. Picked it up and brought it into the light. A dog, carved from a single piece of pine, sitting with its ears pricked. The proportions were approximate, and the tool marks were clearly a learner's work, someone who had been shown how to use a knife, but was still developing the skill. But the essential thing was right. The ears were round, not pointed. The chest was broad. The tail rested flat rather than curling. A sled dog, the kind that had worked the Northern Territories for generations, the kind her father had chosen specifically for pulling equipment through deep country drifts, the kind that Flint was. She set the carving on the bedroom windowsill where the light reached it and went to find June. June turned the figure over in her hands with the careful attention she gave to anything she intended to draw later. She held it next to Flint and compared. Flint endured this examination with dignity. A boy made this, June said. How can you tell? She considered. The ears are right, but the paws are too big. Boys always make the paws too big. She set it on the table and studied it from a foot away. He was practicing. Petra thought about Caleb Pallister, 11 years old in the winter of 1873, learning to carve in a hidden house under a Wyoming ridge while his mother fixed walls and dried herbs and wrote practical notes in a notebook for strangers. Learning something real and difficult and leaving proof of it behind. She understood suddenly and clearly why the figure had stayed on the shelf. Some things were not meant to be taken. Some things were meant to be part of the place. She put the carving back on the bedroom windowsill. On the 34th day, she found the tin box. She had been reinforcing the north wall properly, not the surface patch from earlier, but a deeper repair, pulling the soft plaster back to the stone and relaying it with a clay ash mixture she'd refined through 4 test patches on less critical surfaces, working close to the floor in a lower section. She felt the clay give differently under her knife, not the soft give of frost-damaged backing, but the hard, hollow sound of something behind the plaster that wasn't stone. She worked carefully around it, removing plaster in pieces rather than chunks, and found a void in the rock, not natural but shaped, roughly cut, sealed across its face with a clay plug painted over to match the surrounding plaster. Someone had made and concealed this deliberately, done it well enough that she'd nearly missed it. Inside the void, a tin box roughly the size of a book, sealed around its lid with a wax ring dried hard. Inside the box, a folded document in a single gold coin, $5, dated 1856, worn smooth from handling. The document was a second copy of the land survey. Not identical to the one in the cabinet, slightly different margins, a different stamp in the corner, but the same property, the same description, the same signature at the bottom. Obadiah Morrow had made 2 copies and hidden the second one behind the wall. He'd kept the first one accessible and put the second somewhere only a careful person would ever find it. She read the property description again. 40 acres, Elk Horn Ridge, including the feature described as rock formation with interior accessible from east face, approximately 1/4 mile north of Creek Junction. The cave. He had described the cave in a legal document. He had included the house implicitly by including the cave. She sat back on her heels and held the coin and thought. The land had belonged to Morrow. He had left in 1863 without filing abandonment or transfer. Wyoming territory had been organized in 1869, which meant a new set of land laws had applied to every acre in the territory, including this one, and she didn't know precisely what those laws said about a claim that predated the territory's existence. But she knew one thing she had not known before she opened that tin box. The land had a history, and the history had paper behind it, and paper mattered in ways that Gideon Winslow had demonstrated very clearly by using it to take her father's house. Paper cut both ways. She put the coin in her coat pocket and the document inside the notebook, wrapped up both in the oilcloth, and put the package under the straw mattress in the bedroom where it was not visible and not easily found. That night she made a list in the notebook, at the back, behind Caleb Pallister's entry. Not a list of things she'd done, but a list of things she needed to know. What homestead law said about prior territorial claims, what the 6-month residency provision covered, what the process was for filing at the land office in Laramie, and how long she had been here. She counted. November 3rd she had left the Sweetwater house, 34 days in the cave. That put her at the 7th of December. 12 weeks until the middle of March, 16 weeks until the middle of April. If 6 months was the threshold, she needed to be in Laramie by the first week of May. She added that to the list and closed the notebook. Cold in February was of a different character than the cold of November. November cold was aggressive and wet, a cold that came at you. February cold was settled, established, certain of itself in a way that suggested it had no particular need to prove anything. It existed at a temperature that made every breath visible and made the metal of the saw handle painful to touch without wrapping it in canvas first. She managed the February cold by managing her mornings, out before full light to collect ice from the spring basin, which had frozen at the surface but moved freely beneath. Wood from the indoor stack before the outdoor temperature dropped below what she needed to spend more than 30 minutes outside. The fishing was harder in deep winter. The trout had gone sluggish and deep, but she learned to weight her line further and wait longer. And waiting was a skill with a technique, something she had become better at. June had started singing, not constantly, not loudly, but while she worked at whatever she was working at. Fragments of things, hymns, mostly, and songs their mother had sung, and occasionally something that didn't seem to be from anywhere. Melodic phrases with no words that June repeated and modified the way she modified her drawings, incrementally, seeking the right shape. Petra listened from the other room and didn't say anything about it, because saying something would have made it self-conscious, and she didn't want that. It was during one of these mornings, Petra cutting wood near the creek and June's voice audible from inside the cave as a faint thread through the cold air, that she looked up from the splitting block and found she was not alone. He was standing about 30 yards downhill near the base of a pine cluster, watching her. Past middle age, thick-set, wearing a brown wool coat and a hat that had been good quality once and was now simply serviceable. He had a prospector's pack on his back and the prospector's unhurried way of standing, the manner of men who had spent a great deal of time in terrain where sudden movements caused problems. She set the axe down slowly, blade to the wood, handle up. She did not reach for the knife. He watched her do this. Gideon Winslow's paying me $2 to find his niece. His voice was a working voice, dry and flat, accustomed to being practical. Brown hair, traveling with a young girl and a gray-white dog. Petra said nothing. She waited. He looked toward the cliff face. The cave entrance was not visible from where he stood, and then back at her. I've been working this ridge since January. He shifted his weight, found some sign. Enough. She kept her hands at her sides. He looked at her the way people look at something they're trying to price. Not unkind, appraising. What I can't figure, he said, is why a man would pay $2 in February to find someone he claims owes him paperwork. Usually when someone owes you paperwork, you wait for spring. The cold was making her eyes water. She didn't blink. Name's Silas Drum. I worked survey crews through this country in 68, 69. Know it better than most. He looked at the ridgeline, then back at her. You've been here a while. That's not accident, that's management. Someone managed this place in winter, which is not simple, which means either you knew what you were doing when you came here, or you learned it fast. He looked at her hands, chapped and work-scared, her cuffs ridden up. Looks like you learned it. She had nothing to offer him, no money, no negotiation, no leverage she could name. She had an axe 4 feet away and a 9-year-old singing inside a cave and a notebook under a mattress. What do you want? She kept her voice level. He appeared to consider this as a genuine question rather than a threat or a plea. I want to finish my coffee before it freezes, which I cannot do standing here. He looked at the ridgeline again. There's a seam of lignite running north of this creek about half a mile. I'm going to go look at it. That's what I'm being paid to do, really survey work. Winslow just added the finder's request on after. He picked up his pack frame more squarely on his shoulders. I haven't found anyone today. He turned and went north along the creek without hurrying. Petra stood in the snow until he was out of sight. Then she stood there a while longer, listening to the forest settle back into its ordinary sounds. Then she picked up the axe and went inside. June was drawing on the wall. Flint was asleep. The fire was burning well. She set the axe inside the door and leaned against the wall beside it. June looked over her shoulder. Something in Petra's stillness made her put down the charred stick. Was someone there? Yes. What did they want? Petra looked at the fire, the coal deep red and radiating steadily. He wanted to tell me something without telling me something. June looked at this answer from several angles. The way she looked at drawings she was unsure about. Did it work? Yes, Petra said. I think it did. She went to the bedroom, took the notebook from under the mattress, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened it to her list. She read what she had written. 6 months, Laramie, homestead law. Prior claim, land office. Then she added one more line in the careful hand she used when she wanted to be sure she'd read it correctly later. Silas Drum, survey, knows the ridge. Not working for Winslow, not entirely. Then she closed the notebook, put it back under the mattress, and went to help June with the fire. That night she found the last entry in the notebook, the one she had missed, because it was written not on a page, but on the inside of the back cover, in small letters easy to overlook unless you held the cover at an angle to the light. Agnes Pallister had written it, the hand smaller and more deliberate than her previous entries, as though she had come back to the notebook at a specific moment to write something she'd been thinking about for a while. There will come a day when the person reading this has to decide whether this place is a shelter or a home. Those are not the same thing. A shelter is somewhere you survive. A home is somewhere you choose. I chose. I hope whoever reads this gets to choose too. She held the notebook open and read those words in the firelight until she had memorized them. Not because she was trying to, but because they settled into her the way things do when they arrive at exactly the right moment and you have no defenses up because you weren't expecting anything. Outside the cave, the February wind worked along the ridge. The ponderosa overhead shifted its way through roots that ran deep into the stone. Inside, the fire was steady. The house was warm. The walls were holding. She had been here 91 days. She needed 183. She turned to the blank page in the notebook and wrote the date and a single sentence, the only thing that felt accurate, still here, still deciding. Then she went to bed. March came in the way Wyoming March always did, like something that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to be. Some mornings the light through the cave fractures was almost soft, suggesting the world was considering a thaw, and then by afternoon the wind would pick up from the northwest, and the temperature would fall back below what it had been in January, as though the season had made an offer and immediately reconsidered. Petra had stopped trusting the warm mornings. She kept the firewood stacked to the same height she'd maintained through February, and kept her coat on until midday regardless of what the light suggested. She had been counting days on the inside of the kitchen cabinet since December, a single mark for each, grouped in fives. She counted them now, 123. 60 more to reach 6 months, the first week of May. She had been thinking about the homestead law carefully, working through what she knew and what she needed to know, treating the gaps in her knowledge with the same respect she'd give a weakened floor joist or a chimney with a blocked flue. The gaps were real and they mattered. She knew the general shape of the law from things her father had said and things she'd read in the Sweetwater County Gazette over the years. But general shapes were not legal arguments. She needed someone who worked with those documents, who would know what a prior territorial claim meant against a current homestead filing, who would know whether her 6 months of residency counted from the day she arrived or the day she filed. She needed Laramie. The thought of Laramie raised a different problem, which was Silas Drum. She had not seen him again after the morning by the creek, but she'd found his camp sign twice more in the weeks following a fire ring a half-mile north, disturbed snow near the lignite seam he'd mentioned, the parallel depressions of a bedroll near a south-facing rock that would have been warmer than the open timber. He was working the ridge in a methodical, unhurried way that told her he was being paid by the day and not the result. A man paid by the result would have pressed harder after finding her. A man paid by the day had different calculations. She needed to find out which set of calculations he was actually running. She waited for a clear morning and went looking. He was where she'd expected, working along the lignite seam with a prospector's pick and a small scale, taking samples and wrapping them in cloth squares in a way that suggested professional survey rather than speculative digging. He heard her coming and didn't turn around either. He wasn't concerned by her approach, or he had been expecting her, and she thought it was probably both. Stopped 10 feet away. You haven't filed anything. He kept working. How do you know that? Because if you'd filed a finder's report with Winslow, someone would have come by now. Someone other than you. He set his pick down and turned around and looked at her the same way he had the first time, appraising and unhurried. You've been counting the days, he said. Not a question. Since November. He pulled a cloth from his coat pocket and wrapped a sample chip in it with the careful hands of a man who took his samples seriously. Gideon Winslow is not a man I'd work for if I had better options. Winter survey work in the Elk Horn country is what a man does when the better options have run out. He looked up at the ridge. The lignite seam is real and it's decent quality. That's worth more to me than $2 for finding somebody. She said nothing. He looked at her. You need a witness. Someone who can stand in front of the land office in Laramie and say you've been on this ground since November. I've been on this ridge since January. I know you've been here since before that because I can see it in the work. He gestured a brief, economical motion taking in the cave entrance area, the stacked wood debris she'd cleared, the old deadfall she'd worked through. That's months of management, not days. What do you want for it? Question sat between them for a moment. The lignite seam. Whoever ends up holding this land, I want a surveyor's right of access to the seam and a percentage if it comes to anything. Filed properly, recorded. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, which he held out without stepping toward her. I wrote it out. You can read it before you agree to anything. She took the paper and read it in the cold. Brief and plainly written. Access rights to the north seam, 20% of any mineral extraction revenue, contingent on her successfully establishing a land claim to Elk Horn Ridge. If the claim failed, the agreement was void. He had signed it at the bottom in a hand that matched the kind of man he was: deliberate, legible, no ornamentation. She folded it and put it in her coat. I'll need 6 weeks more. I can wait 6 weeks. She looked at him. He picked up his pick and went back to work, and she understood that the conversation was over and that she had just made the first alliance she'd made since her father died with a man she'd met in the snow 3 months ago who had decided, for his own reasons, that her cause was worth more to him than Gideon Winslow's $2. She walked back to the cave. June was in the storage room when she returned, which was unusual. She had reorganized the shelves at some point in the morning, the tools arranged by size along the lower shelf, the rope lengths coiled and hung on a peg Petra hadn't known was there, the tin of nails sorted by approximate size into 3 smaller tins found in the back corner. The order of it was undeniable. You did this. June looked at the shelves with the even-handedness she applied to her own drawings. The nails were all mixed together. It was inefficient. Petra looked at her sister, this 9-year-old, who sorted nails by size and fixed Flint's ears 3 times until they were right and hadn't cried once since they'd left the Sweetwater house. Where did you find the extra tins? Behind the rope. There are also 2 hinges that don't belong to anything. She paused. I put them on the middle shelf because I thought maybe they'd be useful later. Petra thought about what their mother would have made of this child. Her mother had been practical in the deep structural way that some people are not efficiency for its own sake, but a genuine impatience with waste, with things not being in their best possible arrangement. She'd passed it to June complete, apparently, while Petra herself had gotten the stubbornness. She went to the kitchen, opened the notebook, and read through everything she'd written since December. The list she'd made in February was still there. Her questions about homestead law and prior claims in the filing process. She added Silas Drum's name in the terms of their agreement. She added the date. Then she turned to Agnes Pallister's entries and read them again. Not for information this time, but for something harder to name. Agnes had come here with nothing and had left with her boys in a direction. She had not fixed everything before she left. She had fixed what she could, named what she couldn't, and left the rest for the next person. That was a particular kind of wisdom, the kind that knew its own limits without being defeated by them. Petra was going to need that wisdom in Laramie. The morning the fever found June was in the 3rd week of March. It arrived overnight, announcing itself not with drama but with the small, factual evidence of a child who was too warm when she should have been cold, whose eyes, when they opened, had the slightly remote quality of someone not quite fully present. Not frightening, not a deep fever, nothing that changed the color of her face or made her movements wrong, but real and requiring attention. Petra went directly to the kitchen drawer and took out the remaining dried herbs Agnes Pallister had left. The yarrow was nearly gone. She had a substantial amount of dried thyme and 1 good bundle of willow bark, which was the most useful of the 3 for this purpose. She stripped bark pieces into the tin cup and poured hot water over them from the pot on the trivet and let it steep until the water went the color of pale tea. June drank it without complaint and made the face of someone tasting something that was medicine, and therefore not expected to be pleasant. How long do I have to stay in bed? Until the morning. June considered this like a logistical problem. Can I have the notebook? Petra thought about it. The notebook had never been only hers, it had been Morrow's, and Agnes Pallister's and Caleb's in his careful child's hand at the back. She brought it to June with a charred pencil sharpened to a fine point. What are you going to write? June settled the notebook on her knees. I don't know yet. She opened it to the first blank page past Petra's last entry. Can I draw on it too? Yes. She left June with the notebook and went back to her own work. By evening, the fever had broken as cleanly as it had come. June was sitting up against the headboard with the notebook open, working on something with the absorbed concentration that meant she'd forgotten to be aware of time. Petra looked over her shoulder. June had drawn the cave, not the map version. Not the rough sketch geography of her wall drawing, but something different. An interior view, looking from the cave entrance toward the house, the roots hanging from the ceiling above it, the light coming through the cracks. The proportions were nearly right, the sense of depth achieved through the overlapping of the root shapes, in a way that shouldn't have worked for someone who hadn't been taught perspective but did anyway. Below the drawing, in her careful large-lettered hand, J.W. 1883. I was sick here and then I got better. The house helped. Petra looked at that sentence for a long moment. You fixed the notebook, she said finally. June looked up, not understanding. Morrow wrote in it. Pallister wrote in it. Now you. Petra straightened up. You put yourself in it. June looked at the page, reconsidering her own work with the critical distance she always brought to finish things. I'm only 9, she said, as though this might be a disqualifying factor. Agnes Pallister's boy was 11. Petra went back to the main room. He left the carving. The last week of March arrived with a thaw that felt more serious than the previous ones. A ground-level warmth that turned the snow at the cave entrance to slush and made the creak audible from further away than usual as it moved faster with the melt. Petra began preparing in earnest. She needed to spend as little time in Laramie as possible. Go in, reach the land office, file the claim, get Silas his witness statement certified by the land office clerk, and leave before Gideon had any chance to learn she'd been in town. She counted the marks again, 156 days, first week of April. 6 months from November 3rd was the 3rd of May, 4 weeks still to wait. She spent those 4 weeks doing every repair the house needed that she'd been deferring. The roof had 3 places where the cedar shingles had lifted and needed reseating, which required improvised scaffolding that used most of her remaining rope. She used the notebook's construction section to confirm the correct method for reseating split cedar without access to new pitch, which involved heating the existing pitch with an iron held over the fire and working quickly. The repairs held. She reinforced the storage room shelves with diagonal bracing cut from the straightest pieces of deadfall, joining them with pegs rather than nails because she was low on nails, and pegs were stronger in this application anyway. The notebook said so, and her own observation confirmed it. She rebuilt the water pipe from the spring to the kitchen. 2 sections had failed over the winter, the fitted joints separating from the freeze-thaw cycling, and she replaced them with sections she carved herself from green aspen wood cut near the cave entrance. Green aspen would shrink slightly as it dried, tightening the joint rather than opening it. She did these things not only because they needed doing, but because she wanted the record of them. She wanted someone who came here after to find a house in better condition than she'd found it, and she wanted that fact to be visible in the work. She was not a sentimental person. She was a person who believed that evidence mattered, that the proof of having been somewhere was in the condition of the things you touched. On the morning of May 2nd, she went to find Silas Drum. He was where she'd left him a month before, still working the lignite seam with the patience of a man for whom the work itself was the day's structure. He had a small camp established now with a canvas lean-to and a fire ring that showed regular use. He looked up when she came through the timber. "Tomorrow," she said. He nodded once and began putting away his sample kit. She told June the plan that evening, sitting at the kitchen table, the fire at its ordinary low May level now that the hard cold was finished. She explained it the way she explained difficult things to June, without softening the difficulty but without amplifying it either, because June had proven repeatedly that she processed hard facts better than managed versions of them. "I'll be gone 2 days, maybe 3. She put both hands flat on the table. "Silas Drum will check on you once each day. You know where the food is. The fire is easy now. Flint knows this place as well as either of us." June looked at this information from several angles. What if Gideon's people come while you're gone? Flint will hear them before they reach the entrance. If that happens, you go to the back of the storage room and you close the door and you be quiet. They can't get in without knowing where the passage is. The snow branches I put up last February are still there, and the passage looks like a rock face from 10 feet. No one finds it unless they already know it's there. June held this, and Silas knows it's there. Silas Drum found himself a job worth doing, Petra said. Men like that don't burn the thing they're working toward. She meant it, and June could hear that she meant it. They left before first light. The trail down toward Laramie was longer than Petra had mentally compressed it to be during the winter months, when she'd run the route in her head as a planning exercise. In her head, it was 4 hours. On foot in May mud, it was closer to 6, and Silas set a pace that covered ground without appearing to hurry, the pace of someone who had walked long distances for most of his working life. He didn't talk much, which she appreciated. What conversation they had was practical: the state of the trail, in 2 places where the spring melt had taken out the lower path, the location of a reliable water source 3 miles from town, where they stopped to fill their bottles. He told her the land office opened at 8 and closed at 5, and that today was Wednesday, which meant they'd get the afternoon clerk, a man he'd dealt with once before whose manner was businesslike and fair. Laramie announced itself first as smell coal smoke horses, the particular chemical edge of a tannery operating somewhere on the south side, then as sound, then as the specific visual density of a working town in spring, mud-streaked and busy, the streets carrying the compressed energy of people who had been inside for 4 months and were settling accounts with the outdoors all at once. The land office was a frame building on the north side of the main street, unassuming, with a painted sign and a covered porch that needed painting. Inside, 2 clerks' desks faced the public counter, and at the nearer one sat a man in his 30s with the organized desk of someone who thought systematically and the slightly ink-stained fingers of someone who thought on paper. Petra put the tin box document and the cabinet document on the counter. The clerk looked at them without touching them, Then at her, then at Silas, standing slightly behind her right shoulder. Homestead filing? Prior territorial claim with 6-month residency, she said. I need to know whether those are separate filings or one. He picked up the Morrow survey document and read it with the attention of someone who knew what he was looking at. He flipped it over and examined the territorial stamp, set it down, picked up the tin box copy, and compared them. These are both Obadiah Morrow. He left in 1863 and didn't return. The property has been unregistered since Wyoming Territory organized. The clerk set both documents down in precise alignment, turned to the shelf of bound ledgers behind him, and pulled the 1869 volume. He ran his finger down a page, then another, closed the ledger and put it back. There's no transfer on record and no abandonment filing. The land went into unregistered status when the territory organized. He looked at her. That makes it eligible for homestead claim under the 62 Act as modified by territorial incorporation. Your 6 months of residency with documented improvements would satisfy the primary condition. He paused. I need a witness statement for the residency. Silas stepped forward and put his own folded paper on the counter. His written statement, prepared in his camp, stated that he had observed signs of continuous habitation at the Elk Horn Ridge property, beginning no later than January of the current year, and consistent with a longer period of occupation based on the extent and character of the improvements visible on the property. Clerk read it. You're a surveyor? Silas produced his credentials. He had, it turned out, a formal territorial surveyor's license, something Petra had not known until this moment. The clerk looked at the license, looked at Silas, looked back at the license. Licensed surveyor's attestation satisfies the witness requirement. He pulled a blank form from the drawer under the counter and began writing. I'll need your full name, Miss Petra Ann Winslow. He wrote it. He wrote the property description from the Morrow documents, the survey bearings, the creek reference, the ridge reference, the 40 acres. He wrote the date of the filing. He asked her 3 questions about the improvements she had made and wrote her answers. He asked Silas 2 questions about the condition of the property as observed and wrote those answers too. Then he dated the form, stamped it with a brass stamp from the stand at the corner of his desk, and slid a copy across the counter. Ward Calloway is the deputy land recorder. He'll countersign this tomorrow morning and the claim will be on record by Thursday. He looked at her across the counter. Congratulations, Miss Winslow. The property is yours pending the 60-day confirmation window. She took the paper and held it without looking at it. The door behind her opened. Gideon Winslow came into the land office with the particular energy of a man who had been moving quickly and was trying to look like he hadn't been. He was heavier than she remembered, wearing town clothes that were good quality, but not quite right on him, the clothes of a man who had recently acquired the money to dress well and hadn't yet figured out how to wear it. He stopped when he saw her. The calculation in his face was fast and visible. He looked at the paper in her hand, at the stamp on the clerk's desk, at Silas Drum standing to her right. He arranged his face into something that was meant to be confident and only partly succeeded. She has no legal standing to file. He addressed the clerk, not her. She's a minor. She is 22 years of age, the clerk said, with the flat patience of someone correcting a fact rather than arguing. That's documented on the filing. Gideon shifted approach without pausing. The land may be subject to a prior mineral claim. My company has been surveying the northern ridge. Silas spoke without moving from where he stood. I'm the surveyor working that ridge. There is no filed claim. Gideon looked at Silas with an expression that recalibrated visibly. He had not expected Silas to be here. He had expected, Petra thought, to find her alone. He looked back at the clerk. The girl left a property in Sweetwater County that was under active transfer. Abandonment of the property during an active transfer may constitute. Describe the transfer, the clerk said. The pause that followed was brief but complete. Gideon had walked himself somewhere he hadn't intended to go. The clerk's question was neutral, the genuine inquiry of a man who processed land transactions and wanted the relevant facts, and it required Gideon to either describe the Sweetwater transfer or stop. If he described it, he would be describing it to a government clerk who would know immediately that a transfer requiring a living adult heir's signature and lacking that signature was not a completed transaction. If he stopped, he was acknowledging that there was nothing to describe that would help him. The transfer was executed through the Sweetwater County clerk, he said. With the primary heir's signature? The clerk reached for his pen. The room was quiet. Outside, the street moved through its ordinary May morning. Somewhere a horse was being shod, and the sound carried through the walls in a regular metallic rhythm. Gideon Winslow said nothing. The clerk set his pen down. He looked at Gideon for a moment, then at Petra, then at the form on the counter. I'm going to need to note this exchange in the filing record, and I'm going to send a letter to the Sweetwater County office requesting documentation of the transfer you referenced. He looked at Gideon steadily. That's standard procedure when a question about a related property comes up during a filing. The color in Gideon's face shifted in a way that told her everything about what the Sweetwater transfer documents actually contained. He had been certain she would never be in a position to create a problem. He had been certain that a 22-year-old woman with no money and a 9-year-old sister and a dog thrown out in November would not be standing in the Laramie land office in May with a licensed surveyor beside her and a stamped homestead filing in her hand. He left without saying anything further. The clerk looked at the closed door for a moment. Then he looked at Petra. The letter will go out Thursday. She put the filed copy of the claim inside her coat, against her chest where she could feel it. Outside, Laramie was still doing what it had been doing before being a working town in spring, not particularly concerned with what had just happened in the land office. The sun was high enough now that the mud on the main street was drying at the edges, leaving a crust that crunched underfoot. Silas was beside her on the porch. He looked at the street without commenting on what had happened inside, which was the response of a man who understood that some things didn't need annotating. "I'll stop by the deputy recorder's office this afternoon," he said. "Make sure Calloway has everything he needs for tomorrow." She looked at him. He had done more than witness. He had stood in that room and been exactly what she needed him to be, without being asked to be anything more than that, and she thought that was a rarer quality in a person than most people allowed. "Thank you," she said. It was not sufficient, but it was honest. He nodded and walked toward the recorder's office. She started the walk back. The trail was easier going up than she'd expected, or she was less tired than she'd expected, which amounted to the same thing. The mud on the lower section had dried slightly in the afternoon warmth, and the footing was better. She walked steadily and thought about very little except the specific details of the path, the placement of her feet, the way the ponderosa country thickened as the altitude came up, and the aspens began to appear in their thin trunk clusters, shimmering already in their first green. She reached the cliff base in early evening. The light was going amber through the trees. She went through the passage and into the cave. June was at the kitchen table. Flint was at the door, already on his feet. When Petra came through, he walked to her and pressed his head briefly against her hand, then went back to the door. June stayed at the table, watching Petra cross the cave floor, watching her come up the porch steps, watching her come through the door. Petra reached into her coat and took out the filed claim and held it across the table. June took it with both hands. She read it with the careful concentration she brought to any written thing, her lips moving slightly over the formal language of the survey description. Then she found the line she was looking for, and she stopped. "Petra Ann Winslow, Elk Horn Ridge, 40 acres. She looked up. "Is this ours?" Petra pulled out the chair across from her sister and sat down. The fire was low but present, the coals good, the stone warm. Outside the cave, the evening was coming in through the ponderosa country with its particular blue quality, the blue of high Wyoming evenings in May. The blue that meant the cold was not coming back tonight. "It's ours," Petra said. June put the document flat on the table and smoothed it with both hands, carefully the way she smoothed the drawing when she was satisfied with it. Flint moved from the door to the hearth and lay down. June was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, it was in the practical, settled voice she used for things that were decided. "I'm going to draw the house." "On what?" She looked at the kitchen wall, the map she'd been building since December, the creek and the fish and the hawthorn stand, and the dotted line to the timber and Flint with his correctly rounded ears. She looked at the section of plaster to the right of it, clean and unused. She looked at Petra. "On the wall," she said, "so whoever comes next knows what it looks like." Petra sat with that for a moment. The fire cracked once, a small, definitive sound. She thought about Obadiah Morrow carving, built for those who come after with a careful knife into a beam he would leave behind. She thought about Agnes Pallister folding a quilt she wouldn't keep and leaving herbs for a woman she would never know. She thought about Caleb Pallister, 11 years old, learning to carve an ear the right shape and leaving the proof of it on a shelf. She thought about June, 9 years old, who had not cried once in 6 months, who sorted nails by size and fixed drawings until they were right, and had just put her name in a notebook that had been keeping its record for 24 years before she arrived. Petra got up from the table and went to the kitchen drawer and took out the piece of charred stick June used for drawing. She held it out. June took it. She went to the wall, considered her space, and began. Petra went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. She took the notebook from under the mattress and opened it to her last entry, the one that said "Still here, still deciding." She looked at it for a moment, then took the charred pencil from her coat pocket and drew a line through it. Not to erase it had been true when she wrote it. She drew the line through it because it was not true anymore. Below it she wrote, "P.W. May 1883, filed the claim. Silas Drum witnessed. June is drawing the house on the wall so whoever comes next knows what it looks like." She paused, fixed the roof, rebuilt the water pipe, added bracing to the storage room. The north wall held. She looked at what she'd written, then wrote one more line below everything else. "For whoever comes after." She closed the notebook. She didn't put it back under the mattress. She carried it to the storage room and set it on the middle shelf, in plain view, beside the extra hinges and the rope coils and the sorted nails in their 3 small tins. Beside it, she set the Morrow documents in their oilcloth. Beside those, she put the tin box with the coin still in it, because the coin had been placed there as a kind of proof, and it should stay where proof lived. From the kitchen, she could hear the soft, focused sound of June working. She went to the doorway and watched. June had the proportions right from the start this time, the house sitting properly in the cave space, the roots coming correctly through the ceiling above it. She was working on the porch now, 2 steps, the railing, the angle of the roof, Eve exactly as it actually was. She was going to be good at this, Petra thought. Not just at drawing, at the particular skill of seeing a thing as it really was, and putting it down accurately so someone else could understand it without having been there. That was a useful thing to be able to do. That was the kind of thing that outlasted the person doing it. The fire needed wood. She went and added 2 pieces and adjusted the damper slightly. Outside, through the cracks in the cave ceiling, the last of the evening light was doing what it always did, finding the specific surfaces, making them momentarily clear, then letting the dark have them back. Flint was asleep, the house was warm, the claim was filed. June kept drawing.